So all of this isn't to say that games are bad or wrong, which is what it might sound like. If we say that games are wrong, then this itself is a game. Saying that games are wrong is a game. And the reason it's a game is because we've created this situation where there's a right and a wrong. And that's our definition of a game. So there's no way that we're morally judging games and saying that games are wrong. What we can say about a game is that it's a nullity. It cancels itself out. And the reason it cancels itself out is because it's a polarity. Right and wrong is a polarity. North and south is a polarity. Yes and no is a polarity. And the key thing about polarities, the only thing about polarities really, is that they cancel themselves out. So there's no need to say that a polarity or a game is wrong, because that's giving it credence. It's a nullity. It's neither right nor wrong. It's a game. So when we come back to what we were talking about before, we can maybe take away this idea that we shouldn't be playing games or that we're punished for playing games. Games just are what they are, and that's all there is to it. And it so happens that we gravitate towards playing games. It very much happens that we very much gravitate towards playing games. The guy who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull, Richard Bach, he said human beings are game-playing creatures. Now the thing about playing games is that whilst there's a pleasurable side to it, there's also a painful side to it. And the pleasure and the pain always cancel each other out. So as I've just said, it's a null situation. So what we can go on to say is that not only is there this frustration of it being a null situation, i.e. all of our works always come to nothing, all of our achievements are always completely undone, everything we say is true and get to believe is true is reversed on us later on because it isn't true. So the satisfaction we get from saying true things and believing in true things, because we all get satisfaction from saying true things. There's this kind of look that comes onto our face. It's like, yeah, well, I just said a true thing, so we get to feel good about ourselves. And that, of course, is the whole thing about the game. If we look at things that way, by saying a true thing, I'm having the security of being right. And that's fine. I can see what that feels like. But then I have to have the reverse of that experience, which is being undermined, and to find out that what I've said is right isn't right at all. It was just my arrogance to say it's right. So when we put it like that, we can see that ultimately despite the fact that we could say we enjoy games and we gravitate towards playing games, we never bring anything out of a game, because everything balances out exactly to zero. And further on from this, we can also say something that's very interesting about the nature of security, and about the nature of the security that we get from playing games, or from being right, or doing things right, which all we human beings love so very much. Every time we see an argument going on, it's like two people, each of them determined to show that they're right, even though being right is a meaningless concept. And even though, if I do manage to believe that I'm right, even if I can't convince anyone else, if I manage to believe that I'm right myself, I'm going to pay for that satisfaction later on. So it's going to come back to bite me. So as pursuits go, it hasn't got much to recommend it really. But coming back to what I was about to say, it all sounds kind of fairly, in a way, mysterious to talk about security and the fact that we're seeking security or ontological security. On one level, we know what it means, we get a sense for what it means, we know what it is to be secure and insecure. But what does it really mean? What does it really come down to? And what it really comes down to is creating the mind-created sense of self. So we could say that we play games in order to feel validated, or in order to feel secure, and that's perfectly fine to say that. But it's closer. It hits the mark better to say that we play games in order to create the self. Outside of games, there can be no mind-created sense of self. The only way the mind-created sense of self can have any apparent reality is when we play a game. So, if we want to have the experience of being a mind-created sense of self, and very evidently we do, that explains why we play games. That explains why we love playing games so much. And actually what that means is that a concrete sense of self is a game. It's a polarity, we could say. And it's composed of two things: getting it right and getting it wrong. So in the adventure of being the concrete self, we always get it right to the extent that we get it wrong, and we enjoy euphoria to the extent that we suffer dysphoria. Or we enjoy pleasure to the extent that we suffer pain. So the concrete sense of self is a nullity. And there's no way it can be otherwise, because it's a polarity, because it is balanced out in that way. And this explains the cryptic expression of the alchemists when they said, "Congratulations and condolences," which, as far as I know, actually comes from a kind of pictorial representation, or an engraving of some sort. There's a banner flying overhead, and that's what it says in Latin. Congratulations and condolences. So we can apply that to the status of being the mind-created self. if someone became the mind-created sense of self, we could congratulate them and clap them on the back for it and say, well done, that's great. But only to the same extent that we have to commiserate with them. So this is a very odd situation. And it is a way of looking at our situation that is deeply unfamiliar with us, to us. Despite the fact that the perception of being this concrete sense of self is the very centre of our experience as we go through our lives. No one ever says this. No one ever makes the very pertinent point that being the mind-created sense of self is a nullity. And yet if we don't make this point, nothing we're saying is worth a damn, really. So it's an absolute fact. You can read as many books on psychology as you like. The self is never questioned. And they're moving outside of psychology into the world of everyday life and our shared or collective understanding about what reality is. The self is never questioned. The possibility of questioning it is never mentioned. So even in the past, in a religious context, we might have felt that the self or ego is a kind of ugly kind of a thing that needs to be toned down and taught a lesson or two and humbled. A humbled self is no less a self than an arrogant self. It doesn't make any difference at all. Seeing the need to humble the self is not questioning the self. So to tie this in to the most basic idea that I was talking about in the first instalment, that there's two types of movement that are possible. One is linear movement, or willed movement, which is movement that always cancels itself out and therefore doesn't really take us anywhere. And the second type of movement, which takes us away from everything we know or think we know into a world which we realise we don't know, which is a type of movement that happens just as soon as we let go. As soon as we start letting go, that movement creeps in and we find ourselves going in that direction. So another way of putting that is to say that is the movement away from the self. And furthermore, we can also say that this movement away from the self is the only movement there is. There is no other type of movement. And the reason there is no other type of movement is because there is no self. But what we are wholly concerned with isn't the movement away from the self. We are wholly concerned with extending the self, making the self stronger, more concrete, improving the self, etc., etc., etc. We are completely hooked on that, which is an obsessive concern, rather than a concern which is based on any actual interest in what the world is all about or what we are all about. And because it's an obsessive concern, it brings nothing but misery. It is essentially stuckness. It's a state of stuckness. We're really, really, really stuck. And we're making that into a virtue. Stuckness comes about as a result of holding on. So we've made holding on into a virtue. When we talk about achieving our goals, that's a way of extending our assumptions about the world. It's a way of extending the self. Goals don't mean a thing when we move away from the self. Who's the goal for, after all? Goals are no good at all when you move away from the self. So what we're looking at here is a situation where these two ways of being. One is the obsessive, stuck, holding on way of being, which creates misery. Even though this misery can be pleasurable at times, maybe half the time it can be pleasurable misery, and half the time it's very, very painful misery. And then the other way of being in the world is where life becomes not a matter of consolidating our illusions, or consolidating, not that we'd say that, but a matter of consolidating what we already believe, or consolidating the known, or consolidating the self. The other way of being is an adventure. It's exactly corresponds to what Joseph Campbell calls the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is a hero's journey because you have to be a hero, and you have to be a hero because letting go of everything we know and letting go of the self is the ultimate challenge. Our reflex is to do the opposite, so we have to go against that reflex, which is what the alchemists call the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. And so the thing we don't like about that, the thing that none of us like about that, is that it is challenging and risky. So that's the initial thing. But if we embark upon the hero's journey, then we discover that that is what life is. We discover life, in other words. And if we don't embark upon the hero's journey, which is absolutely what our society doesn't want us to embark upon, then we don't discover life. We get locked into, instead, what Joseph Campbell calls the negative adventure, which is adventure turned on its head, security seeking, and eventually we get to the same place, because despite all our security seeking, we're still going to move in that direction. We're still going to move towards the unknown, because that's the only direction, the only type of movement there is. So it's still going to happen, even though we're refusing the call, as Joseph Campbell says. Only this time, when it happens like this, it's not much fun, to put it mildly. It's not a barrel of laughs, because we're being dragged, kicking and screaming, towards something which we have unconsciously and maybe consciously identified as being the enemy, the thing we don't want. So we've made the hero's journey, we've demonized it. So then when we go on the hero's journey, it's not as a hero we go on it. And so instead of consciously embarking upon this journey and experiencing what that feels like to be consciously engaged upon the hero's journey, it's like we're being dragged very, very unwillingly and experiencing the whole thing in terms of absolute fear. So that's interesting to look at life in this way, because if we can look at life in this way, as clearly as this, and put those two possible ways of being on the table, and say, well, there we are, they're the two possibilities for life. Then we can say, well, apart from saying, well, wow, there's a hell of a difference between the two, we can also say, well, whoever would want to have the negative adventure instead of the actual adventure of life? And obviously nobody would. It's just that we don't see things like that. Okay, thanks for watching.